Good evening. I'm Kelly Wright. Thanks for joining me as we spend this next hour together. I do hope that you're safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family wherever you are. My opening observation tonight focuses on educate. Now, to educate is to teach, to train, to inform someone. It comes from the Latin word educare, meaning to bring up, rear. In the 1500s, Shakespeare borrowed the term to make it mean schooling. And certainly we're all talking about schooling these days in terms of will we reopen due to the COVID pandemic so that our children can go back to school. But schooling also applies to another factor. Many of us need to be schooled on race matters in this country, including the President of the United States. You see, on Tuesday, the president was asked by a former colleague of mine, Catherine Herridge, about the George Floyd death, to which he stated it was terrible. But then when she pressed a little bit further to ask the president why we continue to see so many blacks die at the hands of police brutality, well, this was his response.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way. More white people.
The fact of the matter is, Mr. President, all of us need more schooling to understand just how deep and wide the problem of police brutality in the Black community is. Because the facts are that blacks are 3.5 times more likely to be victims of police brutality. So we still need some schooling. Now, Bishop Claude Alexander is talking about a national dialogue on race, and he's compiled some information. And one aspect of his information for the dialogue on race revolves around educate. Here's what he states. There is an ignorance of history in terms of the depth and extent of domestic terror, neglect, etc., that has occurred within America. Many of our contemporary issues, he adds, are outgrowth of the unreconciled past. An example is the tension between law enforcement and communities of color. And he's right. And this racial tension is what we're addressing in cities throughout America. We see it in the protests from Black Lives Matter, and we will be doing it on this show tonight, focusing on having a conversation on race. And we'll do it as often as we can because it ultimately leads to repairing our divisions, healing our land by educating, by schooling ourselves on how we can get beyond our division so that we can clearly state, united we stand. And those are my opening observations. Welcome to the program. So I'm talking to Mark Harris now. He's attorney Mark Harris. And Mark, it's good to have you on. You, of course, represent the Ben Crump Law Firm. You're a civil rights attorney. I got to ask you the question that many people are asking. What was the president thinking yesterday when he responded about police brutality and the Black community and then stating it happens to white people, more white people, more white people? Because on the surface, one could arguably say, Mr. President, that's not true. When blacks are 3 times more likely to be impacted and hurt because of police brutality.
You know, it's the difference between kind of literal, contextual, figurative. They all have a problem here in terms of the kind of gobbledygook associated with this issue. This is a horrific statement by the president, in my opinion, because it doesn't keep the main thing the main thing. Let's start at the beginning. First of all, he is factually correct. More white people die at the hands of police violence than Black people do. That is a factual correct statement because there are more white people in American society and living in the United States by vast numbers than Black people. So just on the numbers of it, yes, he's numerically correct. He's literally correct. But that's so much not the point. Your point is the point that African Americans are 3 times as likely to die in an engagement with law enforcement. There's a problem with that. If it were any segment of our society that had a 3-to-1 problem, a 3-to-1 presence in terms of anything that would be this negative, we should look into it. And the president should be willing to look into it. And instead of taking the absolute position that basically tongue-in-cheek white lives matter and white people are dying in larger numbers at the hands of law enforcement, I think the better position, the more accurate position for the president to take would have been one to say, look, this is a problem in this country. Not all police are bad. You and I have had that discussion before, Kelly, but there is something wrong with the institution of policing when you're 3 times more likely to die as an African American than you are as a Caucasian when you encounter law enforcement.
So, Mark, in addition to talking about the president, there is something else that's been breaking, and you're privy to that because of your colleague, Ben Crump. What's happening?
Ben Crump, my colleague in Tallahassee, Florida, is, as you know, one of the lead attorneys representing the family of George Floyd. He is filing a lawsuit on behalf of that family as we speak. They have talked about it in press conferences and in other context, but the actual lawsuit will be filed against law enforcement in Minneapolis later today in the state of Minnesota. I'm so very proud of Ben Crump for filing that lawsuit.
And that's an important step. Will it have anything to do with the criminal case against those police officers involved in the death of George Floyd?
Unfortunately, they're on 2 separate tracks. It'll be up to the Attorney General Ellison in the state of Minnesota to continue to prosecute those officers who are involved. This is a small effort in the whole scheme of things to bring some peace and satisfaction to the family from a financial standpoint. None of us can bring George Floyd back, unfortunately. What this will do is to give his family some level of compensation, allow his children to have resources going forward. So I'm very proud of Ben Crump for bringing this lawsuit on behalf of the family.
Well, thanks for bringing some comment about that, because that is an important element in this whole getting justice for George Floyd. And like you said, while we can't have him back, we can at least see his family seek justice and receive justice from a civil standpoint as well as ultimately a criminal standpoint. Mark, I appreciate you so much, man. It's good to always have you on this program.
Thank you.
And isn't it ironic that we're talking about the George Floyd case on the heels of the president saying it was a terrible thing that happened to George Floyd, but then his statement on police brutality and the Black community. It's just the irony of ironies, if you will.
These things are connected, absolutely connected.
Appreciate you so much, man. Take care of yourself. God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you, Kelly.
Coming up, we're going to be talking about race, the conversational race. That's next as we strive into this effort of saying united we stand. That's next on the show. Welcome back to the program. So as you know, one of the things that I've often said on this show, it's an echoing the sentiment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that in this present time, in this present darkness, we must show light. In this time where hatred could prevail, we must let love prevail. And certainly we must learn to live together as brothers, or we may perish together as fools. So when we have a discussion of race, it's important that we have a serious discussion about what's going on in terms of the protests that are going on, the Black Lives Matter, and whites and blacks and browns, yellows and reds, all God's children stepping out to protest. But there are other ways to protest too, not just in the streets, but through policy, and certainly through having important conversations. And one of the conversations that has been missing has been with members of the church who will come out and talk about it. We've talked about it on this show, so I'm delighted to talk about it today by introducing you to 2 gentlemen who are really engaged in racial reconciliation and healing around the globe. They are engaging leaders to positively impact their cities around the world. So I'm joined by Mac Peer and Bishop Claude Alexander. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight on the Kelly Wright Show, and certainly it's an honor to have you on because of the significant amount of work that you've been doing through an organization called Movement.org, which is catalyzing Christian leaders to spiritually and socially impact the urban centers where we live. Mac, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you because I understand that Movement.org is something that you launched, and I just want to ask you why.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Great to be here, Kelly. Movement.org really grew out of a 35-year prayer movement in New York City. My wife and I moved to New York in 1984 when New York was experiencing many of the same kinds of unrest that we're experiencing today. The city was very violent, very poor. The church was very challenged to respond to all that. And we built an informal network of churches across the racial and denominational spectrum to pray together. And we've been doing that over the last 30 years. And that eventually led to the formation of Movement.org, which really has a vision to catalyze leaders to bring about spiritual and social flourishing in their city. And we do that by convening leaders. We've convened 40,000 leaders from 400 cities around the world to be in the same room on the same day to really answer three questions. What are our greatest challenges? What do we want to see God do in the next 10 years? And what do we need to do in the next year? And we've been really pleased to see how God has brought very diverse leaders together from around the world. And we're seeing an acceleration of both spiritual and social impact. So that's a bit of how we got here. And I think it's prepared us for this moment, both the COVID moment and the George Floyd moment.
We'll continue our discussion after the break. You were mentioning 1984 when you're in New York City, and I have to go back to that time. That is the time that I'm very familiar with, and no doubt you're very familiar with the racial cases that came about in that time period from 84 through about 92, where there was the Central Park jogger case and the Crown Heights case and the Howard Beach case. And those were very, very tumultuous times that upset the largest city in America with a racial divide that many people thought they could not escape. And yet we've seen New Yorkers get around the church community and get around the faith community to make a significant impact and a change, so that it's become quite a city where many cultures are celebrated, not tolerated, but celebrated. Bishop Claude Alexander, you're down there in Charlotte area, and I'm curious, how did you get involved with Movement.org?
Well, it started in Bangalore, India, of all places. Where Mac and I were attending a meeting of global leaders as it related to the notion of world evangelization. And Mac began to tell me of the things that they were doing in New York. And having been involved in a lot of things in Charlotte, both on the secular and spiritual side as it relates to community engagement and race, what movement seemed to be doing seemed to be an answer for Charlotte in how to engage the widest, broadest expression of the church, bringing center left and center right into the same room. And because of the integrity with which Mac addressed the notion of reconciliation, and that having to be a part of that, an integral part of that, I saw it as being something that would be valuable for Charlotte. And so it's been my privilege to do that in Charlotte and to share in the work around the world.
And gentlemen, in this age of post-George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, which is still not settled, and then Ahmaud Arbery, what's the temperature, the atmosphere that you're sensing in this country, and how does Movement.org address that?
Claude, why don't you go first?
Well, I think that what COVID and George Floyd has produced is the undeniability of the issue. Yeah, an 8-minute, 46-second video is undeniable. And the fact that we've been shut in has taken away the distractions that would lead to us even wanting to deny.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that with that, the intractability of race is something that is now being recognized, because there's never been a time in America where this has not been the problem. And so we're coming to terms with the need for awareness, the need for ownership, and then the need for agency. And I think that what movement seeks to do is to provide an opportunity for people to come into a shared space and to look at what are some facts that are undeniable and then own them, right? And then ask the question, how do we exercise our agency? How do we lean into this personally, practically, positionally, politically, and economically? And so it provides an atmosphere where there has been relationship capital developed to have those types of discussions that go deep.
So when you talk, I want to come back because I want to drill down on Mac, how you made this turn to actually embrace the true significance of racial reconciliation and healing. And then I also like to talk to you, Claude, about how we move forward in achieving this goal beyond just talk, but really in action. So we'll be back with more by having a conversation about race. Coming back with more right after this. Welcome back to the program. So we're having a conversation about race. And as Mac Peer, the founder of movement.org, has stated in the previous segment, he talked about conversation. It's a way to healing. It's a way to finding a solution. Let me just tell you a few more things about movement.org. One is on their website. It's called A Time to Grieve. At movement.org, we grieve over the senseless and brutal deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd in recent days. We have seen the choreography of evil in our streets and in the human heart that has caused these senseless tragedies. We grieve over the depth of our own individual and societal sin. Mac, that's very profound. Yeah. And so how do you move forward in bringing all people together? Blacks and whites, Christians, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, all of them, to the table of brotherhood?
Well, it's important. It's important that we start. Our point of reference is the Imago Dei, that we reference the image of God in every person and the infinite value of every person. And I also think we do have to have some sense of history. For me, when I moved to New York in 1984, I found myself living in a neighborhood that spoke 100 languages. And that caused me to ask the question, how did everybody get here? What's our journey? The most profound thing that I've ever read was Alex Haley's book, Roots. And that led to, it was actually almost 30 years ago. My final paper at seminary at a master's level was the response of the white church to the Black community. So I've been thinking about this for 30 years, lots of conversations. And one of the conclusions that I've made is that one of the great threads of human history has been the suffering of people of African descent. And it's important to understand what the roots of that are, the implications of that, the consequences of that. And one of the things that we talk about in conversations is understanding the 17-generation gap between the introduction of slavery in 1619 and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, and appreciating the cumulative impact on a disadvantaged community, and really asking the question, for people of faith, how do we step into that, make a difference, become allies and advocates? So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having, and we need to have them even more so now, because it really will affect our children and our grandchildren in terms of the world that they'll grow up in.
Bishop Alexander, what about you?
Well, one of the things that I've discovered is that beyond dealing with active racism, we're also dealing with racial indifference.
Mm.
And racial indifference is upheld by two things at least. One is just lack of knowledge of history, right? And then the second piece is the feeling of it's not my fault, right? And so you got to be able to address both. When Max said 17 generations, or you talk about 400 years, and then you delve into that lands on people in a significant way. When you talk about for 350 of those years, the official role of law enforcement was to keep Black people in place by any means necessary. When you speak about things in those terms, then people are able to connect dots. So that's the first thing. But then on the "it's not my fault" piece, right? Well, it's not my fault either. It's none of our fault. But when we have this knowledge of history, then we understand that with our birth, through no choice of our own, were conferred certain privileges and certain burdens that we did not choose, but which we have inherited. And while it's not our fault, it is our problem. And so if we can get to that point, that this is an American problem, right? Mm-hmm. And this is an American Christian problem in the subset, then how do we own that together? And then how do we leverage our collective agency to begin to address it?
Gentlemen, that's both of you are very powerful in your statements. I want to take a break and come back to talk about not only owning the problem, but what role the church should be playing in solving the problem. Yeah. We'll talk about that with Bishop Claude Alexander and Mac Pierre right after the break. Welcome back to the program. So we're having a conversation about race, and what I really like to call this moment is United We Stand. Because united we do need to stand. We already know what division looks like. We've had political divisions. We're still dealing with that on conservative and liberal fronts, Republican and Democrat fronts. The list goes on about our divide. And then we have our great racial divide, our socioeconomic divide. Division multiplied by division is going to leave us divided. To stand united, to say that united we stand, we have to understand that we are one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. And that is what many protesters have been out on the streets actually saying. So the gentlemen talking to me today have created a program called movement.org. And it's a significant impacting program because of its impact around the world, its reach around the world. Mac Pierre, Bishop Claude Alexander, what I wanted to ask you about, as we see Black Lives Matter and other protesters out there, we've seen people seek to denigrate them, put them down, rather than to elevate their cause and step in to help in prayer, in guidance, and in having conversations for healing. And what I'm speaking about people have denigrated them is it's mostly been a lot of people from evangelical churches. What role should the church play in bringing this racial divide to a close and bringing a solution to the problem? Mac?
Yes, the three words that have become important to me in this whole conversation. The first is civility, how we relate to one another,
Yes.
that we can have a constructive conversation. We can disagree, which is fine, but that we need to go from civility to empathy. I think one of the things that needs to happen in the political discourse is that we need to be able to argue the position of the person that disagrees with us. And that will help us at least understand the perspective of the person that's different. But then lastly, we have to be pragmatic. We have to drive toward solutions that are educational, that are economic, that really create opportunity. Because I think at the end of the day, poverty is ultimately rooted not just economically, but relationally. And if we can increase the relational equity across race, across all these different groups within the church community, then I think we have a pathway toward doing something that's pragmatic and long-term.
Yeah, what I would add to that is this notion of being able to eliminate distractions, right?
Mm.
Okay. And so there is the Black Lives Matter concern, and then there's the Black Lives Matter organization, right? And oftentimes people will seek to use their issues with the one to discount the other. And so we have to be very, very careful of that, right? And be able to recognize distraction when we see it and bring people back to what is the fundamental concern within this nation that has been a concern for over 400 years. So that's where we start. And those three pieces that Max spoke about are key to that: civility, empathy, and pragmatism. So on the pragmatism piece, oftentimes when we get people back to baseline, they want to know, well, what do I do?
Yeah.
I want to do something. What do I do? And then it's the notion of, okay, how do I get them to understand they have agency and how do they use it? And I want to speak to the positional agency piece, where one sits and the influence that one has. And the biggest example that I would use is NASCAR and the decision with the Confederate flag. And people will lift up Bubba as the person. But it wasn't just Bubba. It was Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Jimmy Johnson lending their voices to Bubba that moved NASCAR. And so how do we as agents who have the ability to influence exercise our voices that amplifies, extends, and sustains? And if we can get people to realize that, I think that's the pragmatic part that gets things moving, that brings change.
Wow. When we come back, I'd like to talk about what you just said, because part of that challenge is, what do white evangelicals say to the president of the United States?
Yeah.
We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the program. So we're having a great conversation about race on tonight's show, in a segment, or in a show that I call United We Stand, because we have to have heart-to-heart conversations, face-to-face conversations between blacks and whites, and bringing it all together about how we are no longer silent, but actively engaged in caring for each other, and having this dialogue that will help propel us and compel us to do the right thing. And that's become our brother's keeper, not our brother's killer. So just a moment ago, I was talking to Mac Peer, and Mac, of course, you're the founder of movement.org, an excellent organization that deals face to face with racial reconciliation around the world, and that's significant. What do white evangelicals need to do when it comes to addressing some of the things that have been said from the President of the United States? I get it, they're in his base camp, they support him on a lot of conservative issues, but the fact of the matter is that the President has made some missteps and some statements that have caused many people to wonder where he stands racially. And I can't examine the man's heart because I don't know him that way. But when things are said about, more white people die than black people at the hands of police officers, somewhere along the line, people have got to say, Mr. President, let's really have a conversation here.
Yeah. I think as I think about the climate that we're in, I think part of the challenge is that there's fundamentally a lack of statesmanship. I think that's a fundamental issue. And my recommendation to someone who had the ear of President Trump would be to really invite him to be more thoughtful about how things are said, to really have somebody speak into how things are said and how they're interpreted by people across the ethnic spectrum. One of the things I think is interesting, I think one of the great challenges for people of faith right now, regardless of where they are politically, is to understand the challenge of nuance. That when you think about whoever you vote for, whoever the candidate is, I think it's important to appreciate that people vote for a candidate for a myriad of different reasons. That when I look at the last 2016 election, it's interesting. I think the irony of the election is that one candidate had more popular vote, but the other candidate carried 84% of the counties in America. And when you look at that reality, I think we have to be careful that we don't stereotype. I think stereotyping is the enemy of conversation. Yeah. Because as we stereotype each other, people's defenses become high, and it's hard to really think through and talk through what the challenges are. But I am concerned about the lack of civility in the political discourse, and it's across the spectrum. And we need statesmanship on both sides of the aisle to step forward and to have the right conversations. I am thankful for some of the steps that have been taken. They're not enough, but some of the steps that have been taken to bring about economic empowerment through the opportunity zones and some of the investment in historically black colleges, that needs to be done on a much accelerated basis, but it's important to keep the whole context in view as we have these conversations.
Well said, Mac. And Bishop, to Mac's point, he is right. The president has, through his initiatives, really reached out to help historically black colleges, albeit a lot of people say, as Mac has just talked about, they'd like to see more being done. And this is the time. Now is the time to really have this seen as an opportunity of bringing people together. Yes, we are in a crisis. It's not the favorable situation that we'd like to have. We've got a coronavirus pandemic. We've got an epidemic of violence in our country that we've got to confront in our inner cities. And then we've got this racial divide because of so many systemic problems. So what do you say about getting to the point and to the place where the president is practicing statesmanship and Congress is doing the same thing and people are having an opportunity to be civil towards each other so that we can get past this impasse of skin tone?
Well, I would say several things. One is that the Christian view of government is that it is a calling, and that it is a calling. It is something that God has set in place, and that there are standards to which God holds all who occupy those seats accountable. And therefore, the role of the church is to always hold those who sit within that calling under a consistent critique in terms of the standards of God. So that's number one. Whether that person is fulfilling my ideological agenda or not, I must hold him or her under a consistent critique. So it starts there. Secondly, as people of the word, we know that words matter.
Yeah. Stay with me for one more. When we come back, I want to talk to you about where do you see the solution coming from?
Yeah.
We'll be back more with Bishop Claude Alexander and Mac Peer, both of movement.org, right after the break. Welcome back to the program. So again, I want to thank Bishop Claude Alexander and Mac Peer. They're members of movement.org, and what an incredible program that they are doing around the world. Before I ask the final question, Mac, if you could just remind us the basis of movement.org and how many people's lives it is impacting and getting away from the culture of racism and transforming people by the renewing of their minds and their hearts.
Yeah, the vision of movement.org is to see cities flourish spiritually and socially. We currently are working with 40,000 leaders in 400 cities around the world, fostering unity in the church within cities, and then seeking to provide pragmatic answers to the biggest challenges facing those cities. Yeah.
That's fantastic, and of course, the biggest challenge that we have are in those cities, and many people don't realize it, is our racial divide. In other countries, it might be seen as a tribal divide. And having been in Africa numerous times, there's a tribalism that takes place. And we have that even here in the United States, but our tribes are basically color coordinated or politically coordinated. But I wanted to ask you, and I know we can't solve all the problems in one show. So at some point we'll need you to come back and have a larger discourse, if you will. United we stand. How do we get there? What do you see as being the solution to provide the healing that our nation so desperately needs after 400 years of constant struggle within the Black community just to be accepted, treated as equal, not marginalized, not forgotten, but given the opportunity to be the great people that we are. And let's not forget, we've made great, significant contributions, even under duress.
Sure. So if I take this notion of loving my neighbor as I love myself, the way that I get to that is first seeing my neighbor as I see myself. And part of racism is seeing someone as different, less than. And so do I see the person as I see myself, neither higher nor lower, but as I see myself? That's step one. And if I can do that, then I will recognize that what I need, they need. The concerns that I have, they have. And if I can get to that point, which brings to Mac's word, empathy, right? Then I move to ensure that those things that I know I need, that they also have. And the things that cause me fear, I seek to absolve for them because I would want them absolved for me.
Yeah. I think for me, as I think about what the challenges are and what we need to see happen, one of the things that I have a fresh appreciation for is that the greatest cross-cultural moment in history was simply God becoming man. That was the great Passover, as it were. And what I see Jesus doing in the New Testament is he entered into the suffering of other people. And in our modern day context, it's important for those of us that are majority culture to enter into the suffering of those that have had less opportunity, less advantage, and to learn from. When I moved to New York in 1984, the first family that took my wife and I in, she was 3 months pregnant, we had no place to live, was an African-American couple. And they entered into our suffering because we were homeless. And so it's an opportunity for us, and to be pragmatic. If it's economics, if it's education, if it's opportunity, to really enter into that. I love Claude's word of agency. Sometimes it's time to pray, and sometimes it's time to shovel the snow. And so we have to understand when it's time to shovel the snow, and we have to enter into that and do it with others. I mean, the challenges are so great. It's going to really take a coordinated effort, and we're in early stage efforts to do some big things, and we really pray that in the next several weeks that we can announce some things that can bring benefit to communities that are challenged in 50 cities across the U.S.
Well, I want to thank you both for being actively engaged in this fight for freedom.
Yeah.
It's a freedom that we all can stand united because we're trying to bring brothers and sisters together from every tongue, every tribe, every nation, every color, to make this a great nation. And as I've often said on this program, the greatness of our nation actually begins in the homes of its people. So my prayer for you is that as you move forward with movement.org and you get to that place that you're getting ready to do something really big, don't forget us here in this program. We'd love to be help to you becoming a change agent and making others have agents of having a collective dialogue at that table of brotherhood. Mac Pierre, Bishop Claude Alexander, thank you both. God bless you. And thank you for helping us to understand that united we stand.
Great.
We'll be back with more of the program after this. I want to thank my guests for having this conversation. It's an important conversation that I pray will lead to healing, because we certainly need that in this country. And my final word is this. Hopefully, we've ignited, and united to not spread racism, but to educate, to drop some knowledge on each other and spread love, freedom, and peace. Because the times, my friend, they are a-changing. Good night.
Come, writers and critics who prophesy with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming.